September 1944, a tree line near Arracourt, France. The morning mist clings to the tall grass of an open meadow. 150 meters away, a stone farmhouse stands silent. It looks peaceful until you see the black slits of machine gun nests cut into the cellar walls. American soldiers crouch in the dirt, their knuckles white as they grip their rifles. They are not waiting for the rumble of tanks or the scream of incoming shells. They are clicking long, serrated blades onto the muzzles of their M1 Garands. A battalion commander stands behind them, checking his watch with a look of intense, academic satisfaction. He believes this is how wars are won. He believes in the glory of the charge. George S. Patton is about to show him that a thesis written in ink is worth nothing when it is paid for in the blood of young men. This is the story of a commander who prioritized a tactical theory over the lives of his soldiers and the general who held him to account. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when old hierarchies met new realities. By joining us, you help preserve these accounts of leadership, consequence, and the hard lessons learned on the front lines of history. First Lieutenant Paul Marchetti was 25 years old. He came from a tight-knit neighborhood in Providence, Rhode Island, where the smell of salt air and Italian cooking defined his youth. He had joined the infantry not for the thrill of combat, but because he felt a quiet, persistent obligation to the boys he grew up with. He was a man of few words and steady hands, a platoon leader who had already earned the respect of his men through 3 months of grueling hedgerow fighting. Marchetti carried a small, frayed photograph of his younger brother in his pocket, a boy who had died of polio just before the war began. That loss had made Marchetti fiercely protective of the lives under his command. He viewed every soldier in his platoon as someone's brother or son, a life to be spent only if there was no other way. On this morning in September, he stood in the damp grass of the French countryside, looking at his men's faces and feeling a cold knot of dread tighten in his chest. Major Harold Witcomb was 42 years old and hailed from an old money family in Richmond, Virginia. He was a career officer who had spent the years between the wars polishing his boots and his reputation at the infantry school. Witcomb was a man of deep, unshakable convictions, most of which were rooted in a bygone era of warfare. He had written a lengthy, celebrated thesis on the psychological superiority of the bayonet charge, arguing that the sight of cold steel broke the enemy's will in a way that bullets never could. To Witcomb, firepower was a crutch for the weak, a mechanical substitute for the raw warrior spirit he demanded from his subordinates. He walked the lines in a perfectly tailored uniform, his brass buttons gleaming even in the gray morning light. In his hand, he carried a custom-engraved bayonet that had belonged to his father in the First World War. He looked at the fortified farmhouse not as a tactical problem to be solved with iron and high explosives, but as a stage upon which he could finally prove his academic theories to the world. He was ready to sacrifice anything to see his thesis validated in blood. By September 1944, the race across France had slowed to a grueling crawl. The heady days of the August breakout were over. The Allied supply lines were stretched thin, reaching back hundreds of miles to the Normandy beaches. Gasoline was more precious than gold, and every village became a fortress. In the Lorraine region near Arracourt, the German army was no longer just retreating. They were digging in, turning ancient stone farmhouses into deadly strongpoints. These structures featured thick masonry walls that could shrug off small arms fire in basements that provided perfect cover for MG-42 machine guns. The German defenders were desperate, well-armed, and possessed the advantage of height and cover. General Patton's First Third Army was famous for its mobility, but mobility required more than just speed. It required the seamless coordination of infantry, artillery, and armor. This was the era of combined arms warfare. By 1944, the idea of an isolated infantry charge was considered an antiquated relic by most modern officers. They knew that a single Sherman tank could do the work of an entire company if given the chance. Yet, in the chaos of a rapid advance, the chain of command sometimes frayed. Communication gaps and the vast distances between units meant that local commanders often held total life-and-death authority over their sectors. Some of these men had not yet unlearned the lessons of the Great War. They still viewed the battlefield through the lens of individual courage rather than industrial efficiency. while the rest of the army looked for ways to save lives using steel and shells. A few remained obsessed with the romanticized image of the bayonet. They ignored the reality of automatic weapons and high-velocity rounds in favor of a personal code of honor. This stubborn adherence to outdated doctrine created a friction that was often paid for in American lives. It was in this environment of shifting tactics and lingering arrogance that the situation at the farmhouse began to spiral. Marchetti moved through the wet grass to the rear of the battalion line, where the major stood. The lieutenant wiped sweat from his upper lip despite the morning chill. "Major, we've got clear sight lines on 3 separate machine gun apertures in that cellar." Marchetti said, "If we move across that field now, they'll have us in a crossfire before we cover 40 yards. We need to suppress those positions." Witcomb didn't look up from his watch. He adjusted his gloves. "The schedule is set for 09 Nu, Lieutenant. We don't wait for things to be easy." Marchetti leaned in closer, keeping his voice low so the men wouldn't hear the desperation. "Sir, I just got off the horn with the 704th Tank Battalion. They've got a section of Sherman's 2 miles out. Their ETA is 20 minutes. If we wait for the armor, they can blast those nests into rubble from the tree line. We wouldn't have to lose a single man." Witcomb finally turned his head, his eyes cold and distant. 20 minutes is an eternity in combat, Lieutenant. Waiting for tanks shows the enemy we are hesitant. It shows weakness. We are the United States infantry. We win with grit and cold and steel, not by hiding behind iron boxes." Marchetti felt a flash of anger. "It isn't hiding, sir. It's common sense. That open ground is a bowling alley, and my men are the pins. Give me 20 minutes, and I'll give you that house without a scratch." Witcomb pulled his father's engraved bayonet from its sheath. The steel caught the dim morning light. "You're young, Marchetti. You rely too much on these mechanical crutches. A bayonet charge shows the German that we mean business. It breaks his soul before we ever touch his skin. Firepower is just noise. The blade is what wins wars. This is about the spirit of the attack." Marchetti looked at the bayonet, then back at the farmhouse. "Spirit won't stop a MG-42, Major. It's suicide." Witcomb straightened his jacket. "That is an order, Lieutenant. Fix bayonets and prepare to lead your men. If you lack the stomach for real soldiering, I'll find someone who doesn't." Marchetti knew there was no winning the argument. The major was chasing a ghost from a thesis paper. He turned away and walked back to his platoon. He told his sergeant to get the men ready. The report of the major's refusal and the impending slaughter was radioed back to regiment by a horrified observer. It reached Patton's headquarters within the hour. The heavy rumble of a multi-tone horn cut through the sounds of distant artillery. A mud-splattered jeep screeched to a halt in the center of the command area. The stars on the bumpers were polished to a mirror shine, and as the dust settled, George S. Patton stepped out. He did not look like a man who had spent the morning in a safe bunker. His helmet bore 4 gleaming stars, and the ivory grips of his revolvers caught the pale French sun. He walked with a calculated, rhythmic gait that commanded immediate silence from every officer in the vicinity. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply stood before the battalion command post and waited for Major Witcomb to emerge. Witcomb stepped out and snapped a crisp, textbook salute. "General, an honor to see you at the front," he said. Patton looked at the major's clean uniform, then at the dirt-streaked soldiers nearby. "Major, I've been reading some very interesting casualty reports today," Patton said. His voice was high-pitched and thin, but it carried across the field like a whip. "Tell me, how many men did you lose in the assault on that farmhouse this morning?" Witcomb stood taller. 23 killed in action, sir." But the position was taken with cold steel. Patton squinted at him. "And did you have tank support available for that objective?" "We did, General. But they were 20 minutes out, and I decided the momentum was more important." Patton's eyes moved to the custom bayonet hanging from Witcomb's belt. "And you believe that a piece of sharp metal is superior to a 75mm high-explosive shell, do you?" "I believe in the psychological superiority of the charge, sir," Witcomb replied. "It defines the warrior." Patton took a step closer, his face inches from the major's. "I love the bayonet, Major. I carry one myself. It's a fine tool for finishing a fight. But you seem to think you're at a sporting event or a medieval tournament. This is a modern war of industrial slaughter. You had tanks 18 minutes away. If you had waited those 18 minutes, 23 Americans would be eating lunch right now, instead of being stacked like cordwood behind a hedge. You decided to trade their lives for a chance to prove a thesis you wrote in a comfortable office in Virginia. You aren't a gladiator trainer, and these men aren't your playthings. They are soldiers with the most powerful combined arms machine in human history at their disposal, and you chose to leave that machine in the garage because you wanted to show the enemy you meant business. Well, the enemy is dead now, but so are my soldiers. The tanks arrived shortly after your bloodbath and leveled that house with a single round. One shell, that is the price of that house. You paid 23 lives. That is not leadership, that is criminal vanity. You have a great love for the spirit of the bayonet, so you can go back to the infantry school and talk about it all you want. You are relieved of your command. Pack your bags and get out of my sight before I decide to let you lead the next charge yourself. Alone, Witcomb stood frozen, his face turning a deep, humiliated red as the general turned his back and walked toward the survivors. The dismissal was not a quiet affair held behind closed doors. Patton ensured the entire battalion saw the cost of vanity. He ordered the remaining men of the company to form a loose perimeter around the command tent, while the major was forced to strip the insignias from his collar in the open air. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and the metallic tang of spent brass from the farmhouse. Witcomb moved with a mechanical stiffness, his face a mask of pale shock as he realized his career was ending in the mud of a French field. He reached for the custom-engraved bayonet on his belt, perhaps intending to keep it as a final memento, but Patton stayed his hand with a cold stare. The general took the weapon and tossed it onto a wooden crate in front of the survivors. It clattered against the pine boards, the ornate engraving catching a stray beam of light. Patton announced to the gathered soldiers that leadership was a contract of trust, and that today that contract had been broken. The men watched in a heavy, somber silence as Witcomb was marched toward a waiting rear echelon jeep. There was no cheering. There was only the quiet, hollow realization that 23 of their friends were gone for a lesson that had already been taught 1,000 times before. Paul Marchetti spent 6 months in a military hospital recovering from the shrapnel wounds he took during the charge. He eventually returned to Providence, where he took over his father's small grocery business. He was a quiet man who never marched in parades and never joined the local Veterans Hall. He married a girl from 2 streets over and raised 3 sons, but his family noted that he could never stand the sight of an unsheathed knife, even in the kitchen. He died in 1989, and buried in his casket was a small, tarnished brass button he had gripped in his hand while lying in the grass outside Arracourt. Harold Witcomb never saw another day of combat. After his relief, he was shuffled through a series of administrative posts in England before being sent back to the United States. He retired as a colonel in 1952, largely due to family connections that smoothed over his record, but the Arracourt incident followed him in whispers through the halls of the Pentagon. He spent his final years in Virginia, writing a memoir that attempted to justify the bayonet as the ultimate expression of military character. He died in 1974, still insisting that the failure at the farmhouse was one of execution by the men, not of the theory itself. Patton rarely mentioned the incident in his official correspondence, though he did make a brief entry in his private diary that evening. He wrote that a leader who loves his own ideas more than his men's lives is a luxury the American taxpayer cannot afford. He kept the engraved bayonet in a crate of captured souvenirs for several months, before eventually ordering it to be melted down with other scrap metal. He told his aide that he didn't want the weapon of a fool taking up space where the tools of a soldier should be. What Patton did, when a commander chose bayonets over tanks and lost 23 men, in 2 minutes September 1944. A jagged tree line outside Arracourt, France. The morning air is thick, with the smell of damp earth and the metallic tang of oiled steel. A stone farmhouse sits 150 meters away across a flat, naked field. It looks peaceful until you see the slit trenches and the black muzzles of MG-42s, tracking every shadow. American soldiers crouch in the dirt, their knuckles white as they grip their rifles. The order comes down the line, passed from man to man like a death sentence. Fix bayonets, no artillery prep, no smoke, just steel and a sprint into the mouth of a machine gun. The men look at the open ground and then at each other. They know the math of lead and skin. They know what is coming, but George Patton is coming too, and his brand of justice is sharper than any blade. This is the story of a commander who valued a blood-stained theory more than the lives of his men. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when arrogance writes the orders. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply reassigned the commander to a desk job? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happens when arrogance writes the orders, make sure to subscribe.